In the first two parts of this series, I used the example of a college dropout struggling in the job market to explain some of the pitfalls at economics discussion. This time I want to zoom in on that example, summarizing the analysis I've done so far, and exploring some of the other viewpoints we could still look at. In part 1, I talked about how a diploma is more than just a piece of paper. It is a signal. To put it simply, there's a gap in information between an employer and a potential employee, because the employee tends to have more knowledge about their potential productivity than the employer does. A person that has a high productivity potential can try to bridge this gap in information by investing in a signal to show his or her potential. Then I went on to hypothesize a reasonable scenario where an employer only accepting applications from candidates with a college diploma could be acting in the interests of their company, even if there were qualified candidates without a diploma. It is true that there are signals other than higher education that an employer can look for, but having talked to the people who do hiring, the reality of the situation is they often have other responsibilities and simply don't have the time or the energy required to look through every resume they receive in detail. Since employers usually have a general sense of the quality of different colleges, it is quicker and easier to just check for a diploma than it is to evaluate that other criteria. In part 2, I talked about how picking apart the logic of a claim without considering the context that claim came from can be offensive. I didn't pay attention to the context that John's objection to diplomas being overvalued was rooted in him feeling personally undervalued for not having one. So I was droning on about how diplomas are not being overvalued without realizing what I may be implying about John. All I was trying to do was open up a dialogue about an economics concept that was relevant to John's predicament. But in his eyes, I could be easily seen as just another person prejudging him without all the relevant information. Personally, I think not being rude is reason enough to choose your words carefully, but ignoring context can cause more problems than hurt feelings. Without the context of the question, an answer will be oversimplified to the point of uselessness, lacking all nuance and substance. Part of John's argument was about how there are many candidates without a diploma who are more qualified than candidates with one. I dismiss these anomalies as irrelevant because a useful signal doesn't always need to be correct. It just needs to be correct on the aggregate. The problem is breaking signals into a dichotomy of useful and not useful is an oversimplification. Counterexamples do not disprove the greater trend, but they do suggest the signal may be weaker and therefore not as useful, which is very relevant. While signaling theory shows that businesses reap the benefits of higher education by using it as a vetting process, those benefits are not free. One of the reasons jobs that require a degree pay so well is part of that salary is meant to go towards compensating the employee for their investment of going to college. So if the difference in productivity potential between grads and non-grads is relatively small, an employer may well be overpaying for their vetting process if they require applicants to have a degree. The question of whether or not the benefits of using universities as a vetting tool outweigh the costs for employers can't be answered with a 2-minute explanation of an econ concept. There is no one answer because that question is unique to every employer. You could have an economics debate on the criteria an employer should consider and what information they should prioritize to answer that question based on their individual situation. I'm sure there are people who would be interested in having that debate, and I hope someday I find those 3 people and we can go through all the intricacies to our heart's content. But for now I'm going to move on, because even if I didn't guess that John wouldn't enjoy that conversation based on probability and common sense, I could have worked it out by once again looking at context. Specifically the implication of his last statement. All diploma shows is that you could afford to waste a ton of time and money on a piece of paper. College is an expensive investment, and for someone to make an investment, they must have capital to invest. This puts students that do not have access to capital at a disadvantage. To be fair, there are programs that provide financial aid through scholarships and student loans to make that investment more affordable. Students that show promise as highly productive workers by doing well in their high school classes can get financial aid they need to go to college, particularly if those students would likely be unable to afford it otherwise. But to be even more fair, It is insulting to students of low-income backgrounds to say that student loans and financial aid do nearly enough to bridge the barrier of entry created by high tuition costs. There are people who are unable to complete college because they don't have the critical thinking ability to pass all of their classes. College is also less expensive for smarter students, as they don't have to spend as much time and effort on their classes, and they don't have to retake as many classes to get to the finish line. However, as I mentioned earlier, a useful signal does not need to be right all the time. It just needs to be right on the aggregate. So as long as the barrier to entry of high tuition costs exists, a college diploma will always serve as a signal of a wealthy background. Just as defending the value of a college diploma implies that non-college graduates have less value, explaining that employers can be incentivized to ignore applications from candidates without a diploma implies that employers should not feel obligated to do otherwise. The way John framed his argument suggests he thinks that question is worthy of more than an implied answer. An employer is using an institution that is more accessible to the wealthy as a gatekeeper for determining who is qualified for high-paying jobs. Even if it is a good financial decision, is it ethical to conduct business in that way? This question does a better job of encompassing the full weight of what John is saying about employers. He doesn't just think they are making a poor financial decision, he also thinks they are making a questionable moral decision.